All right. Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to see so many of you joining us here today. I'm Suzanne Hall. I'm Director of Engagement at the Policy Institute at King's College London, and it's a real pleasure to welcome so many of you to this webinar, How to Create a Fair Society. Can the left and right find common ground? We're holding this event in partnership with the Fairness Foundation, and it's another session that's part of our ongoing Fair Society series. The aim of this whole series is to delve into issues of fairness, inequality, and meritocracy, featuring some of the world's leading thinkers. We've been joined so far by Michael Marmot, Manoush Shafiq, Michael Sandel, and today we are thrilled to have this distinguished panel here with us to discuss free and equal. What would a fair society look like? This thought-provoking book was written by Daniel Chandler, an economist, philosopher, and author based at the London School of Economics. I think if I lean out the window, I could probably wave hello. And I really do urge you to read this. I don't want to steal any of Daniel's opening remarks, but it aims to introduce the work of John Rawls to a wider audience because his ideas are not just interesting, they're useful for helping think through a whole range of social policy problems that we find ourselves facing today. Daniel offers up a vision for modern progressive politics through a whole raft of reforms. And that's what I particularly enjoyed about this book, that it offers potential solutions and helps you imagine a hopeful near future. But don't just take it from me. It's been described as a fantastic book, which critically examines the very foundation of our society, challenging us to envision a fairer world. It's a timely and essential read in these times of societal transformation. Alongside Daniel, we're honoured to be joined by Anneliese Dodds, Labour MP for Oxford East, Labour Party Chair and Shadow Secretary of State for Women and Equalities. John Penrose, Conservative MP for Weston-super-Mare and co-chair of the APPG on Inclusive Growth, as well as Ryan Shorthouse, founder and executive director of the think tank Bright Blue. Their insights and perspectives are really going to enrich our conversation and discussion, and we're grateful to all of you for joining us here today. In terms of the format, Daniel's going to provide us with an overview of the main themes and arguments explored in Free and Equal. And following this, we'll turn our attention to the panel to share their reflections and insights on these really important matters. After this, it's over to you, the audience, for questions. So please feel free to submit your questions in the chat. And if you don't want to do that, you can vote for your favourite questions that other people have submitted. So please take the time to have a look at that. And a special thank you today to people who've already submitted their questions in advance. But I think that's quite enough from me. I'm going to hand over to you now, Daniel, and thank you again for joining us. And I hope you all really enjoy this enlightening and engaging discussion.
Great. Thank you, Suzanne, for that really generous introduction, and also to Brian and Anneliese and John for joining the panel, and everyone for logging in at lunchtime. So as Suzanne indicated, what I've tried to do in my book is really set out a kind of big picture vision of what a fair society might look like, drawing on the ideas of the philosopher John Rawls. And I wanted to do that because I think that the free market or neoliberal ideas that have really dominated our political discourse since the 1980s are rightly increasingly discredited. And I think what that means is that we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to try to define or shape a new political consensus. And yet I think that mainstream parties on both the centre-left and centre-right have been struggling to articulate exactly what that consensus might look like. I think it often feels as if we're just being buffeted from one crisis to another without a longer-term sense of direction. And I think that part of the challenge that we face today is a lack of intellectual or philosophical reference points, that while politicians like Thatcher and Reagan, who are the architects of the neoliberal consensus, could look to thinkers like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, I think it's not as obvious where we should look for similar kinds of inspiration today. And as Suzanne suggested, the premise of my book really is that the ideas we need are kind of hiding in plain sight in the work of the philosopher John Rawls. I say hiding in plain sight because Rawls is really, by far the most, the sort of towering figure, I guess, of 20th century political philosophy. This is someone who's routinely compared to really the greatest thinkers in the history of Western thought, people like Plato, Hobbes, Kant, John Stuart Mill, and yet his ideas have had relatively little impact, I think, on real politics. And part of the aim of my book is to kind of drag his ideas out of the academy and put them into our public discourse, where I think they have a lot to offer. And for me, what's exciting about Rawls is that his ideas are they're fundamentally hopeful and constructive. I think they're an alternative to the cynicism that I think pervades a lot of our political discourse today. They're also deeply practical. What we get from Rawls are a set of simple but powerful principles to do with freedom and equality, and hence the title of my book. And those principles really give us a toolkit for thinking through a huge range of questions about how we ought to organize our political and economic institutions. And so at the heart of Rawls's philosophy, I'll just give a kind of quick overview, is the idea that society should be fair. And I think while that abstract idea of fairness has very broad appeal, it's pretty obvious that people disagree on exactly what that means. And one of Rawls's really great contributions was to come up with this thought experiment, which he called the original position, which is really a device for helping us move from the abstract idea of fairness towards this concrete set of principles that we can actually use to think through the political questions that we face. So his idea was that if we want to know what a fair society would look like, we should imagine how we would choose to organize it if we didn't know what our position in that society would be. So whether we would be rich or poor, gay or straight, black or white. And he argued that if we were to think about society in that way, we would make it fair, almost in the same way that we might cut a cake more fairly if we didn't know which slice we were going to end up getting. And what Rawls argued was that if we conducted this thought experiment, we would choose these two fundamental principles. So the first is what he called the basic liberties principle, and that's the idea that everyone is entitled to certain fundamental freedoms, both personal freedoms like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of sexuality, but also political freedoms, and not just the right to vote, but all of the freedoms we need to have genuinely equal opportunities to take part in and influence the political process. So that's Rawls's first freedom principle. His second equality principle has actually got two parts. The first is what he called fair equality of opportunity, which is not just the absence of discrimination, but the idea that everyone should have, again, substantively equal opportunities to develop their talents and abilities in life. But crucially, Rawls also argues that, important as it is, equality of opportunity on its own isn't enough, that we also need, in a sense, fair outcomes, not equal outcomes, but fair outcomes. And that brings us to the most innovative and in many ways radical aspect of his theory, which he called the difference principle. And that's the idea that higher incomes for some can be justified. So it might be justified for doctors or entrepreneurs to be paid more than cleaners, but only if those inequalities ultimately benefit everyone. So in a sense, what he's thinking of is that those incentives, that those inequalities can provide people with incentives to study, to work hard, and to innovate in ways that will increase the prosperity of society as a whole. But what's important is that that prosperity is widely shared, and it's not enough for Rawls just that some of that prosperity trickles down to those at the bottom. Rawls he specified that we should try to organize our economy as a whole in a way that the least well off workers would be better off than they would be under any alternative economic system. So those are Rawls's two core freedom and equality principles. There's also actually a third principle of intergenerational justice or sustainability, which sort of got less attention when Rawls was writing, but obviously is more important today than ever. And the sort of key implication of that principle, which he called the just savings principle, is that we have a basic obligation to maintain the wealth of society, both natural and physical, from one generation to the next. So those three principles rules, really, to do with freedom, equality, and sustainability. They give us this framework for thinking through, a really huge range of questions, from questions about free speech to questions about how we organize democracy, through to questions about inequality and the climate crisis. And to me, I think that's another thing that's really distinctive about Rawls, is the incredible breadth of scope of his theory, bringing all of these questions under sort of within one coherent framework. I think, coming back to the topic of this event, I think they also give us a philosophy that could bridge some of the political and cultural divides that exist in our societies. So, I think two ways in which they do that are, first, that really more than any other liberal philosopher, Rawls was really at pains to articulate a genuinely inclusive liberalism that could appeal to people with very different moral and religious beliefs. And at the heart of his philosophy is really a deep respect for different ways of living, and I think that is really essential for overcoming the culture wars. And in my book, I sort of go into some specific examples of how we might do that in relation to free speech or the clash between gay rights and religious freedom. But I think that's one way in which Rawls can help us bridge political divides. The other is that his economic ideas, I think they recognize both the value of a broadly market-based economy, both for freedom and for economic efficiency, but alongside that insist that the benefits that come from markets are genuinely widely shared. And I think the way he does that really represents the best of what you might think of as the third way kind of philosophy in politics. And the third way, not just as a form of electoral triangulation or kind of wishy-washy centrism, but a genuine and coherent synthesis of the best of the liberal and the socialist traditions. That's really how I think about Rawls's philosophy. I think they also, though, challenge prevailing political ideas in a couple of important ways. First, I think that Rawls is a critic of meritocracy. He recognizes that equality of opportunity is important, but that on its own, that's not enough. And I think that's one way in which, I think the idea of meritocracy has really been the guiding value of economic policy on both the center-left and center-right in recent decades. It's come under quite a lot of criticism recently, including by Michael Sandel, who you mentioned at the beginning, Suzanne. And I think those criticisms are justified. And I think what's great about Rawls is that he points us towards a constructive alternative. The second thing I thought I would want to just highlight about how Rawls sort of helps to broaden out our discussion, particularly about economics, is that when it comes to questions to do with inequality, he's very clear that it's not just inequalities of income and wealth that we should be worrying about, but we also have to think about the distribution of power and control, particularly between workers and owners, and also how our economy does or doesn't give people opportunities for self-respect. And to me, it's that aspect of his thinking that really leads to all the most interesting parts of the economic ideas, and helps us to broaden out towards a much richer and more humane conversation about the kind of economy that we want to create. So I think at the level of principle, there's hopefully lots that people on both the left and the right might be able to agree with. I think maybe where things would get more complicated is thinking through how we put those principles into practice. And unfortunately, that's something that Rawls didn't really say very much about. And really the sort of central point of my book is to pick up where Rawls left off and to really think through how we might put his ideas into practice. And I suppose that's where I'm drawing on my training as an economist as well as a philosopher. I've probably already run over timing-wise, so I won't go that much into the policies. I'll just sort of list a few things, I guess, rather than trying to justify them. But I argue in the book that a codified constitution is something in particular that the UK should adopt as an important part of protecting basic freedoms. I make the case for a form of liberal patriotism in helping to increase a sense of solidarity and shared identity in a diverse society. I argue that we should cap political donations to parties to a very low level and replace them with a democracy voucher system where every individual will be given an equal amount of money per year that they could give to the party of their choice. I look at questions to do with education as well. I argue that we should have universal early years education, that we should abolish private schools, and that higher education should be funded through a mix of contributions from graduates and from the state. And when it comes to the economic ideas, it's that emphasis on questions of power and control and dignity and self-respect that really informs the agenda that I set out in the book. And for me, that points towards three key things. One is a universal basic income or something like it, as the best way to meet people's basic needs whilst supporting their sense of agency and independence. A second is, I guess, a broadly what you might call pre-distribution, an agenda that would try to increase above meeting basic needs, that would try to increase people's incomes, not through redistribution, but by increasing people's earnings, potential sort of earnings capacity, and also by trying to share wealth more equally. And I have some specific ideas in the book about how we might do that. The third and final thing on the sort of economic side is trying to really bring about a shift in the balance of power between workers and owners through adopting a kind of German co-management system, but kind of pushed to its most maximal form. And I think that's, that if we want to genuinely give people opportunities for meaningful work, it's clear that we can't do that from the top down. Nobody wants a kind of department for meaningful work going into firms and telling people how to organize individual jobs. That if we want to change work for the better, then we need to empower workers to bring that about in partnership with their employers. So I think I will try to leave it there. I mean, I imagine we won't all agree on all of the policies, and in a sense that's fine. But I suppose one thing I would say is that I think if you endorse anything like Rawls's principles, it's hard to resist the idea that we need some pretty significant changes in how we organize both our political and economic institutions. And I guess my hope is that by putting some of these bigger ideas on the agenda, that at least opens up the space for a richer, more imaginative discussion about how we might create a fair society.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was a really helpful overview to your work and speaks to so many of the things that we're doing here as well, particularly on the importance of values and bridging divides in the time of culture wars, the kind of policy solutions you're suggesting. So thank you for that. But I now want to turn to Anneliese Dodds, who's kindly going to talk us through her reflections. Over to you, Anneliese.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much indeed, Suzanne, for that introduction, and big thanks to Will Snell and the Fairness Foundation as well for inviting me to join this discussion in the first place, and also for giving me advance sight of Free and Equal. I'm afraid I haven't read all of it. I've read a bit of it, but not all of it. Sorry about that, Daniel, but really great to hear from you just now about some of the themes and arguments that are set out in that book. And obviously the very first line of Daniel's book, I think, is an absolutely critical question for anybody who wants to be involved in politics in any form, which is, what would a fair society look like? And I think, as Daniel rightly says, most people, certainly in our country, would say that they don't believe that our society is fair, and that we do need to work together to fix that unfairness. But I suppose kind of underlying that, of course, is the idea that there is society in the first place. And clearly that is an issue that has not always been uncontentious. Certainly, I suppose for my party, we have written on our membership card, by the strength of our common endeavour, we achieve more than we achieve alone. It's written into our rule book, that idea that collective action essentially can achieve change, and achieve change for society, is not something that's always been uncontested. But I suppose one area where I don't necessarily agree completely with Daniel's assessment is around whether we've actually seen that kind of sterility in political thought that he suggested. I actually think there's quite a lot of confidence at the moment, certainly around the ability of collective action, whether that's directed through governments or through partnerships between government, trade union, businesses, local actors, to achieve change. And I think that has, in some cases, arisen through quite negative reasons, the COVID pandemic, the kind of partnership engagement that we saw functioning there, the coordination. But to me, that says that, society's back, government is back working with society. And I think that actually means we're in quite an intellectually exciting period, as well as an important period for policy development. I'm really pleased to be part of this discussion. As Suzanne mentioned, as the Shadow Women and Equalities Secretary at the beginning, we think that we do need to be focused on tackling inequality in all of its forms, that needs to be a kind of core function of government. But I suppose also that's where I would say the kind of suggestion that there's a kind of established, in inverted commas, political class that seems content with the status quo, I think probably is one where, I mean, I'm sure John would probably agree with this, where actually I think you know, there is a lot of contention. I don't think there is happiness with the status quo. You know, if we look at what's happened over time in relation to relative poverty in the UK, the extent of destitution, but also obviously inequalities based around race and ethnicity, around situation for many women, etc. You know, I don't think there is that acceptance of the status quo. I think there is a desire for change, but as of course Daniel kind of set out near the end of his talk, that the really contentious thing is how you actually get there. And you know, I think it is really exciting and interesting to be applying John Rawls's framework to this, and his two kind of fundamental principles. Of course, Daniel set them out. That first basic liberties principle, that you know, there should be that ability of engagement that you know, that is shared, that is open. I think every mainstream political party, thankfully, is committed to constitutional democracy and a political system, the rule of law, etc. So I think that's an area where there isn't really contention. But I think it is that second principle around fair equality of opportunity and what that actually means in practice, where there is ultimately a lot more contention. But I suppose I would just say, maybe slightly provocatively, actually, but there's not another question here, which is about the ability of policymakers to be adopting that kind of mindset when, you know, obviously it's quite common for political theorists to be looking at these things through a Rawlsian view. But I think for the average person on the street, it can be really quite hard to adopt that, in inverted commas, veil of ignorance. I mean, obviously, Robert Nozick was a really strong opponent of Rawls's approach, and he argued that, you know, very often when there's inequality, that's arisen through processes that are fair. The outcome may not be, but the processes that get us there, he would say a lot of the time have been fair. And I think sometimes the view amongst some people is, well, okay, you say I should place myself in someone else's shoes, but I know they would never fit because I'm not like that. That's not where I am. Obviously, there have been attempts to try and develop that greater common understanding, for example, through citizens' assemblies, you know, getting people to really understand others' situation. But I think quite often we need something more. And when it comes to equality, I actually think we have got quite a strong argument, you know, without having to necessarily go through that process, that Rawlsian process. I mean, it is a very useful one, but even without doing that, I think very often when we talk about arguments for equality, we are talking about arguments that will lead to changes that will benefit everyone wherever they are in that distribution. So they don't need to have to imagine themselves as being at the bottom of the pile. They can see the impact positively for them wherever they are on whatever spectrum we're looking at. I mean, I would think, for example, around some of the issues for women's equality, you know, Labour's set out as our kind of first mission for government that we want to ensure that we will have the highest sustained growth in G7, with good jobs everywhere, and good terms and conditions, productivity rising everywhere. Now, that will not be achieved unless, for example, we tackle the issues for the older female workforce. You know, we've seen lots and lots of older women leaving the workplace. Tends to be pretty bad for them. Their income tends to go down. Variety of reasons why, related to often poor health, issues around childcare, social care, issues around flexibility at work. Now, obviously, we've set out policies to deal with those. But the point I'm making here is, unless we have that greater level of economic activity amongst that group of women, that is going to be ultimately bad for them, but it's going to be bad for our whole economy. And I think those kinds of arguments are really important when it comes to talking about equality, because too often, particularly over recent years, I think we have got locked into sometimes a view that tearing down barriers for one group of people will automatically put them up for others, that you help one group and that somehow will hinder everyone else. The evidence base is very different. The evidence base indicates that actually when you remove barriers for one group, you tend to improve the situation for everyone else. You know, in the case that I just talked about, through having a more dynamic economy, through having more opportunities in the economy for everyone, through reducing the social security bill, and so on and so forth. So I think we need to be saying there's actually almost a third principle here, which is the principle that very, very often equality-based interventions are positive for everyone, wherever they are in that distribution. I think we've known that really, you know, from the time of Michael Marmot's writings on this and many others. So I think it is important we focus on that. But if I may, just to finish, Suzanne, I think in order for us to be always having that framework in mind, we need to make sure we don't get locked into that zero-sum approach to these questions. And I think, sadly, we have seen, as I said, over recent years, too often that suggestion that, you know, if you focus on issues for one group, somehow you're ignoring them for everyone else or making things worse for everybody else. Actually, the evidence suggests the opposite. And I think all political parties always need to be bearing that in mind. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Anneliese. That was such an expansive and thoughtful response to the panel question. So I do appreciate that. Really wonderful to listen about the ideas of citizens' assemblies and their role in creating empathy, but also your reflections on gender equality. And there's definitely a lot of comments and questions coming through on that already. So I'm sure we'll pick up in the discussion. But I now want to hand over to John Penrose MP for his thoughts on the topic.
Well, thank you very much, Suzanne, and thank you to Daniel for writing such a thought-provoking and interesting book, which took me back to try and reawaken my, I've got to confess, previously quite passing acquaintance with Rawls. So thank you very much for that, Daniel, much appreciated. But as Anneliese was rightly saying, writing such an interesting and thought-provoking approach. So thank you to you for that, and thank you to the Policy Institute and for the Fairness Foundation as well for sort of being behind our meeting today. Look, the essay question here is, you know, where's the overlap? Where is there where does the two bits of the Venn diagram between political left and political right overlap around creating a fair and more inclusive economy and a fair and more inclusive society? And I think that there's an awful lot in this book which points us towards where that overlap will be strongest and most fertile ground. A brief point about the liberties principle. I'm not sure that is actually one of the areas where there's an awful lot to develop, simply because I'd agree with Anneliese's point that there's quite a widespread consensus about the importance of it already. And people agree with a lot of it in principle, but the difficulty in practical political terms is at the moment you start talking about constitutional reform, A, there's no votes in it, and B, it's something which rapidly people forget the original position thought experiment and start assuming that the other side are trying to slant the rules of the game and alter the plumbing to advantage them over whoever it may be. So that's a very difficult area where I think there may be less opportunity, but also I think it helps because I agree with Anneliese. I think we're starting a position where an awful lot of the existing constitutional position, while there are indeed some differences, but there's an awful lot of consensus about the fact that we are a constitutional democracy and a liberal democracy and all those things, and so therefore I wouldn't start by looking too long and too hard there, when I think that, yeah, given where we are economically, given the fact that we are in a cost of living crisis, I think that the economic areas are the areas where, you know, the big political questions and the big political opportunities for creating and forging perhaps a sort of, you know, cross-party sustainable consensus might be biggest. And here, I'm going to start at the last of Rawls's principles, which is the just savings principle, which, Daniel, you rightly said got less attention when Rawls's material was first published. I think it's really, really important. I mean, it probably always has been, but I think it's particularly important now for two reasons. One is net zero, where the notion of intergenerational fairness and, you know, us basically plundering, some would say, natural capital and monetizing it at the expense of future generations is very, very important and very, very central to an awful lot of the political debate now. But where I think that while Anneliese and I might disagree on some of the how, I think there is a widespread agreement about the what. I don't think there's anybody serious in British politics arguing very strongly against net zero by 2050, although we might disagree quite a lot about how we get there. So that is a really important area. But the other bit, which I think is thundering down the tracks towards us and hasn't got enough attention, but where the just savings principle really must matter, is over the welfare state. Because given the demographic time bomb, which everybody understands Britain and large numbers of other developed nations are facing, given that, if the welfare state was an insurance company, we'd be bust. The regulator will be knocking at the door. The state's balance sheet is fundamentally not equipped to cope with delivering on all the off-balance sheet promises which the welfare state has made to you and I about what's going to happen to us as we age, as we get ill, etc., etc. And from about somewhere in the mid-2030s, no matter who's in government, the welfare state is fundamentally going to be insolvent unless we change things about it. And that means that the just savings principle is absolutely essential to try and work out something which will allow us to navigate our way through this fairly adequately and without sort of impoverishing future generations even more than we already have. So that's really central and crucial, I think. And I think also that there's a huge amount of potential for cross-party consensus around fair equality of opportunity, because I think in the all-party parliamentary group for inclusivity, which I'm sort of part of, we've ended up using the language of opportunity and agency, and I think if you put those two together, you get fair equality of opportunity in Rawls' terms. And so it isn't enough just to say we are going to go through and do what some of the things that Anneliese was talking about rightly about trying to create reforms to get rid of glass ceilings, to get rid of narrow gates, to give people access to opportunities in society. Yes, you need to do that. Yes, that is essential. Yes, she's quite right that if you do it for some groups, providing you don't turn it into some sort of dreadful zero-sum game, it can have huge knock-on effects to other disadvantaged groups as well. But on its own, that isn't enough. You've got to also equip people with the skills and the attitudes and the ability to grab those life chances when you have destroyed the glass ceilings and the opportunities start to be distributed more evenly and fairly. And if you don't create that agency, if you don't create those the education and the cultural attitudes, then you can destroy all the glass ceilings you want, but you're still going to end up with a bunch of bad outcomes at the end of the day. And I think that's sort of Michael Marx and stuff about health inequalities, for example, is a really good illustration about the persistent problem which successive governments have tried to solve and still eludes not just us, but many other developed nations too. So I think there's a huge amount of opportunity there, and I think that we may be able to create some very interesting thinking about not just lifelong learning and so forth, but also about things like sovereign wealth funds. I think one of the ideas is a citizens' wealth fund. Daniel, now we can disagree about the purpose of that, but there are clear opportunities there to do some sort of cross-party thinking. The only bit where I think we might have more of a difficulty would be on the difference principle, and that's because I think to centre-right eyes and ears, the danger there is that it feels to me like I'm always going to have to go and get approval from people like me or Anneliese for a pay rise. And I'm sure that wasn't what Rawls meant, but the difficulty of putting that into practice is that it creates a vast potential opportunity for enormous amounts of political meddling and state intervention, which I think would slow down societal growth, make us much less nimble as a society and as an economy. And I think there's also danger, and this is an area where I think my side of the political aisle needs to raise its game very dramatically. We have been too absent from the notion about what is poverty, and we've kind of ceded ground to the notion, beloved of parts of the left at least, that it's basically all about inequality of income. And actually, I think that we need to say, no, that poverty is a great deal more complicated than that. And it is, while a basic level of income is absolutely essential, there's a great deal more that is required in order to give people both the potential to get out of poverty, the potential to avoid slipping into poverty, and to define exactly what it is that is poverty. Because in quite a lot of cases, you get people who've defined their version of life success in terms which are much broader and much more complicated than just the monthly or weekly paycheck and how big it may be, mine may be relative to yours. And I just think my side of the political aisle has been off the pitch on that, and that is a serious piece of impoverishment of our political debate. And as a result, the difference principle looks difficult for us as a result. But I'll stop there.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate those reflections, and it was a really helpful contribution to our debate. But to close out from the panel, I'm going to hand over now to Ryan for his thoughts.
Great, thank you. And thank you for hosting the event. And thank you to Daniel for such a thoughtful and constructive book. Now, my philosophy is one of sort of coming from the liberal and conservative traditions rather than the liberal and socialist traditions that perhaps Rawls came through. Perspective, I would say that the three foundational principles that he outlines, whether that's basic liberty principle, fair equality of opportunity, and the difference principle, are quite compelling. And I think it should be comfortable ground for conservatives, the first two principles in particular, which conservatives are a bit more uncomfortable with. And I think conservatives probably have a little bit of a challenge to the process at arriving at those principles through the veil of ignorance. Conservatives would probably say, look, that's discarding the kind of specific and unique history and tradition of societies. Societies don't form from abstract. They have their own traditions and cultures, and principles flow from that. And then also, I think for conservatives, but also for non-conservatives like Amartya Sen, perhaps there would be a challenge to some of the principles, particularly the difference principle, that emerges if you start from an abstract place. You know, maybe resources and attention shouldn't be focused entirely based on need or to those who are the least well off, but perhaps resources and focus should be on the basis of talent or deservingness. So I think there would be some challenge to that as well from the centre right. But in terms of the book, I think as a liberal, from that kind of liberal tradition that I'm also from, in part, I was struck by the kind of defence of the richness of the tradition, that liberalism is not this sort of caricature of market fundamentalism and individualism, but has sought to recognise and emphasise community, belonging, religion. Isaiah Berlin did that a lot in his thinking. And the book is, I think, good at showing the need to balance, as Isaiah Berlin emphasised, the different social goods from security to liberty, that it's a balancing act between those things, as long as individual liberty remains paramount. I suppose where I wasn't convinced was the sort of attack on neoliberalism as the kind of the sort of dominant strand of liberalism. And I would say that we haven't actually lived in a neoliberal state since the 1980s. You know, tax levels, public debt levels, the size of the state are at some of their record levels. And I don't think that's consistent with the idea that we live in a neoliberal state. And even the conservatives during the kind of time of austerity did, for example, increase the minimum wage, and then during COVID introduce furlough. So that to me is not indicative of a dominant neoliberal state. But I think this idea that you balance different individual wants and social goods, which is what I think Daniel tries to emphasize in the book, is a good foundation for cross-party thinking and progress. And I think the book was very good at proposing policies that fit within the liberal framework, but actually might be more appealing to the right than maybe the sort of left liberal comfort zone. So, for example, I was quite struck with the idea that hate speech laws have gone perhaps a little bit too far, and the state should use its expressive rather than coercive powers to limit the more kind of unsavory and immoral views that might be out there. For example, the book also proposed compulsory national citizen service, on the basis that, education is compulsory to prepare people for work. Maybe this should be compulsory to prepare people for citizenship and community. And also the idea that there should be some limits on immigration, which sometimes liberals find difficult because there is some evidence that it can impact detrimentally the least well off in an uncontrolled way. For example, housing demand and a lack of infrastructure for public services. So I thought that was all good stuff. I thought at times maybe the policy recommendations, some of them were a little conventional. And I suppose the danger is that because it's covering so many different areas that maybe you don't go as deep in some areas as possible. So, sometimes I felt that the policies didn't necessarily match the kind of radical, lofty sort of vision that Daniel set out to change society. But where I was struck was by the business ownership and kind of democratizing business ownership chapter. I thought that was particularly compelling and probably fruitful ground for getting left-right consensus. And, the US, for example, has the highest level of share ownership in the developed world, much higher than in Europe, largely because of the tax breaks that can be sought through their ESOP scheme. And I think this is good ground for progressives because it's about democratizing power, but it's also good ground for the right because it's about increasing asset ownership. And the coalition government did some work around public service mutuals, and there was some good progress on that. And then Theresa May talked about having more workers on boards, but then it sort of stopped. And actually, I think there's lots more that can be done around democratizing business ownership, and I think that could appeal to both left and right. So I'd like to see some more thinking on that. I think my kind of final thoughts was really about how the right might see fairness. And I think for a lot of people on the right, they see fairness through the prism of what people deserve, that resources should be allocated more on the basis of deservingness or effort rather than need. Of course, it shouldn't be one or the other. These things are on a spectrum, but I think those on the right would more lean to the idea that it should be based more on deservingness. And I think, it's worth thinking about where there can be common ground in building policy frameworks which get that right balance between both giving enough to those who are in need, but also giving enough to those who have contributed more. So thinking about a kind of contributory society and how you reward both economic contribution more, but also social contribution. And I think progressives should, recognize this as well, that sometimes when we think about contribution, it's more how much have you worked, how many taxes you've paid, but also there's a basis, well, how much have you contributed to the community, how much have you cared for people around you, and that should be factored into that sort of vision of a contributory society. So if you think, for example, of the pension system at the moment, there is a kind of basic state pension which is there on the basis of a need, and then there's a policy architecture on top of that, auto-enrollment, which I think is probably one of the most successful things that the Conservative governments of the past 13 years have introduced, which provides an extra layer of private pension and gives more to those who've contributed more. So how can we build more policy frameworks that both give the need and the contribution? And I would say, for example, on social security, it's almost entirely means-based now, but can we introduce more sort of furlough-like elements to it, where people have contributed more through a sort of auto-enrollment system, not just for pensions, but for kind of welfare, working age support, that they get more out when they go through periods of low or no pay. So that's kind of mirroring some of the social insurance models that happen on the continent. And then also, thinking about the support for children as well, what sort of support is in place. There's a lot, for example, if you think about economic contribution, the government quite recently and quite rightly have done a lot to support childcare. But what about people who choose to stay at home and look after children, particularly in those first years of life? Maybe there should be more support for them to recognise the contribution they're making. For example, front-loading child benefit or increasing the amount of maternity or paternity pay that those people get, which frankly is very measly in this country. So, I suppose my reflections overall is that it's a brilliant book, very thought-provoking, very eloquent, but maybe there's some things, particularly on kind of contribution, which people on the right would want to be more emphasized. And how can we team up with the left to try and build those sorts of policy frameworks?
Thank you so much to get into in the limited time we now have for questions, but I really appreciate all those really interesting perspectives on Daniel's book, even though at times I was having flashbacks to my politics lectures back at university with all the thinkers. But I just wanted to start with some questions that we've had in. There's been a few in the chat on gender, and I was talking to a friend and colleague last night, and she said, oh, really interesting, but Rawls wasn't that great on women, was he? And I just wondered if we could have a little bit of a talk about that, picking up on some of the questions. So how would we evaluate the push for gender equality? Does it make society fairer? And how can we include women in this kind of new economic thinking as well? There's been a very good comment in the chat from Liz Hind. I'm not sure the cleaners or care workers, mostly women, might agree with the principles you've outlined on who should be paid more. Daniel, I'm going to come to you first, and then Anneliese, it would be remiss given your job title if I didn't pick your brains on this, please.
Okay, great. Thank you. Great questions. And just thanks to all those for those three responses. I have so many things I would like to say in answer to various points that came up there, but I'll resist the temptation now. So on the gender question, I think it's fair to say that Rawls didn't say enough about gender. And I think what was interesting over the course of his, I think in his most famous book, A Theory of Justice, he said almost nothing, was then rightly criticized by a number of feminist philosophers for that absence, and then tried to show how his theory could address those kinds of questions in some of his later work. And I've tried to kind of pick that up and flesh that out further. And I think that, the key principle for thinking about gender within Rawls's framework is his idea of fair equality of opportunity, which is not just about equal opportunities for people born into rich and poor backgrounds, but also the idea that everyone should have fair chances to compete for different jobs and positions in society, irrespective of gender or race or sexuality or any other arbitrary characteristic that we don't think should be relevant for accessing different jobs and positions. So I think that Rawls didn't say enough, but that his framework has everything that you need for a very comprehensive account of what justice in relation to gender and also race would look like. In the book, I think that that some of the things that I talk about, I guess that the emphasis of the policy discussion in the book is that that there's more to do to tackle overt discrimination in the workplace, also in the education system, the way that that girls are pushed towards certain subjects rather than others, and the impact that can have on their earnings later in life. But I think that what's more and more clear from the economic evidence is that the primary obstacle to gender equality today is about the division of work within the home, really, when it comes to childcare and other kind of caring related activities. And it's those activities that still continue to be disproportionately done by women rather than men. And it's once women have their first child that really the big gaps in terms of earnings start to open up between men and women. And I think there are some obvious things that we should do, or the most obvious thing we should do there is to make sure that our legal framework, particularly when it comes to parental leave, doesn't reinforce the traditional gender division of labor. And I argue that we should have a system of parental leave that basically gives families an allocation that they can divide up between parents as they see fit, rather than the system that we have in the moment that pushes families towards women taking the bulk of parental leave. And there are some sort of complicated philosophical questions about how far we should go in encouraging men or fathers to take up parental leave, and anyway, I think maybe won't go into that because I want to give others a chance to respond to. But I guess that would be the area where I would focus initially, is on parental leave, and then looking at how we can improve conditions for part-time and flexible work, so that mothers and fathers can balance their work and caring aspects of their lives in a way that suits them better.
Thank you, really helpful. Anneliese, I don't know if you want to come in on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really interesting, and I think there's been a lot of work that has been undertaken into, I suppose, what the drivers are of these inequalities, but then relatedly, what the impact would be of dealing with those inequalities. And my reading of the evidence, I'm afraid, does go back to what I said before, that there generally is not a kind of zero-sum outcome, that somehow there would be a negative impact, particularly on male workers, which I think often is the assumption underlying some people's kind of concern around some of these measures. So, I mean, obviously, Daniel talked quite a lot about care, and it's been quite interesting over recent years, actually, particularly during the COVID period. Lexi Topping's done some quite interesting work on this, that actually the extent of childcare undertaken by men went up quite substantially during the COVID period. It's quite interesting. So there does seem to be, I mean, it's taking a long time, but there does seem to be a bit of an increase in the extent of care that's undertaken by men. And obviously a lot of discussion around kind of shared parental leave. And we think that system does need to be reviewed, because it doesn't seem to be working well at the moment. But then there are questions about when women are actually in work, how that then is dealt with. And again, there's been some change over time. So previously, the bulk of the evidence suggested it was occupational segregation that was driving the gender pay gap a lot of the time. So women working as cleaners, for example, rather than as so cleaners in buildings rather than outside them, and the men doing the cleaning outside, etc., and that kind of occupational difference. Obviously, there's still a fair whack of that, and that's kind of obviously at the heart of a lot of the kind of equal pay claims, right? They're going on at the moment. But then you've also got still stubborn differences in pay within the same occupations as well. So there's something else that's going on. Now, the reason why there's that evidence, I think, about the positive impact of this is that if you have, for example, greater transparency around pay between men and women, or indeed between white workers and Black, Asian, ethnic minority workers in different categories, and so forth. If you have that greater transparency, provided you do it in a meaningful way, actually that tends to be positive for the entire workforce, because it means that there's a greater attention to job evaluation at different levels of that organization. So it tends to be something that produces a more efficient organization, because people are actually being paid, according to the schedule that's been set out by that company, to reflect, the kind of different things that Ryan was talking about as well. So I think that there's sometimes shifting into thinking, well, these measures are necessarily going to have a negative impact on men that are supporting women. Actually, the evidence points in the other direction. Same around activation. Greater female activation in the labour force does not tend to lead to lower activation of men. That would be to assume there's a kind of finite number of jobs, and you'll never have more jobs created. You won't have entrepreneurialism. You won't have creativity, innovation. Well, that's not the way that our economy, certainly in the UK, works.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm keen to come to some of the other questions, because there are some excellent ones in the chat and that we've had in. So if it's all right with you, I'm going to turn to another one now, which is from Ben Fenton. And it says, the division between left and right is arguably less important today than the division between moderates and extremists, between those who wish to solve disagreement and those who wish to gain influence by widening it. The internet has amplified extremism. If we agree on the need to amplify moderation, does the government have a role in doing this? I think you all referred to sort of culture wars issues and divisions in one way or another in your talk. So John, if you don't mind, I'd like to come to you first, and mindful of time, if you could give us a concise response to this complex question, please.
Happy to do that. I mean, I guess my starting point would be to go back to Daniel's opening remarks, where I wouldn't necessarily agree with him about neoliberalism being discredited over the last 40 years, because I think Ryan is probably right that we haven't been living in a neoliberalist society. And in fact, I don't know anybody on the centre-right who thinks of themselves as a neoliberal. I don't think we really know what it means. It's generally something we're told we are by the centre-left. And certainly nobody I've ever heard has talked about trickle-down economics either. We're told we believe in it, but we don't. I think that there is a fundamental issue here about the credibility of how we go about fixing the manifest and very, very obvious problems. So yes, absolutely that. And Daniel is right to say that there is a credibility problem, a legitimacy problem with our current political economy, not just in this country, but in many other developed nations, developed democracies, right the way across the developed world. So yes, absolutely, completely agree with Daniel that that is the central question. I don't think it's just, though, although I think it's a relevant question to say, is it between moderates and extremists? I don't think it is just about that, although I don't think the extremists help at all. I'm completely with you on that. Because if the moderates are, and the rationality brigade, which Anneliese and I would both firmly belong to, if we're going to fix this, then it has to be very quickly about how. And that's where the legitimate political debate about how to fix these underlying issues really rapidly gets in place. So yes, there is an issue with populism in this country on extreme left and extreme right, and in other countries too. But that doesn't absolve the sensible, rational centre-left, centre-right from therefore just saying, well, it's all their fault and we're the answer, because we don't agree on what the answer is. And actually over the last 25 years, since the banking crash, we have solved some problems, but there have been plenty of others that have turned up, and we have not solved enough. And that's the underlying issue. So yes, it's a factor. I don't think it absolves either Anneliese or I from still having to nut out the difficult answers.
Thank you. And Ryan, I wondered if you wanted to come in on that. You mentioned about finding common ground. So
yeah, I mean, it's interesting, populism, because it's often conveyed as a very sort of rightist phenomenon. But actually, in many ways, it also has origins in left-wing thinking, because it's really about power, which is, there's a powerful group of elite people who are sort of controlling the way that society and institutions are run, and the people are being ignored. And this sort of segues into my wider point, where I think there could be common ground. Again, I'm sort of being quite crude in this analysis, but broadly, the left will think about outcomes for particular individuals as a product of different power dynamics, that there are strong and weak groups, and there's discrimination. Interestingly, on gender, for example, in the gender pay gap, some of it is to do with discrimination, but also because it's the motherhood penalty, which is largely driving the gender pay gap. Some of it is down to choice as well. It's not just to do with power imbalances. And I think, have to admit that, to be honest. I'm not saying it's one or the other, it's both, and there's a mixture. And I think sometimes the left can focus on power and the right can focus on individual agency. If only you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and put more effort in, you will get more out of life. Again, this is a crude analysis. I'm not saying that everyone on the left thinks that. But actually, where Rawls invites us to think a bit differently is actually about brute luck and the role of luck in life. So not just power and agency, the power that people have over us and the agency we have, but also just randomness and where we are at the right time or the wrong time, and how that causes different outcomes. And I think actually where left and right can find common ground is to accept that actually a lot of life is to do with randomness, but how can we build institutions which sort of help people who suffer misfortune, who go through misfortune, who suffer brute luck? What sort of social security system is in place for that? But equally, if we're thinking about for social mobility, for people on the right, that's a big concern. Actually, it's about building institutions where people can mix with different people and seek out different opportunities, which just randomly gives them the opportunity to open a door to do a particular opportunity or a particular job. And why middle class people often dominate certain elite institutions and professions is not because they're sort of behind the scenes all plotting. It's some kind of conspiracy. It's just they're in the right rooms, right? And they have the sort of good look to find those opportunities. So how can we widen that to people from poorer backgrounds? So I would say the common ground is more about the role of luck and randomness and how we can design policies around that.
Thank you. And I've seen Daniel making notes on this, so I just want to give you the opportunity to come back, and if you could do so very, very briefly, because we're just at time.
Sure, I'll be really quick. I mean, just quickly to respond to Ryan's point, I think that part of what's so appealing about Rawls's framework is that it recognizes all of those things: power, agency, and luck. And I guess that's part of why I think it's a philosophy that can have quite broad appeal. Just on the moderates versus extremists question, I guess it's difficult to know. Depends exactly how you define those terms. If you think of, I guess Rawls's philosophy is very much on the side of moderation. If you think of moderation as being a philosophy that, endorsing the basic principles of liberal democracy and approaching politics with a certain attitude, a kind of attitude of respect for different views and a willingness to seek common ground and appeal to the evidence. And part of what's appealing also about Rawls, which I try to do in the book, is set out a way of approaching politics that would that sort of would live up to those values, and how, the question also was about what government might do to bring that about. And I also try to look at how we might design political institutions that would encourage that kind of reasonable deliberation, like citizens' assemblies, which is something that came up earlier. But yeah, maybe I'll leave that there.
Thank you so much. I'm really sorry to bring this to a close because there's so much more we could have got into. There's fascinating questions in the chat on the climate crisis, on housing reform, on electoral reform. There's so many places we could have taken this, but I want to thank you all for being a part of this really incredible discussion today. Our exploration of fairness, equality, meritocracy has been enlightening and really thought-provoking. I'd like to extend my real heartfelt thanks to the panel today: Daniel Chandler, Anneliese Dodds MP, John Penrose MP, and Ryan Shorthouse. Really appreciate you sharing your time, but also your perspectives. I also want to express our appreciation to you, the audience, for your engagement, your incredible thoughtful questions, and your active participation. Really does make these events worthwhile and a success. And thank you especially to our partners at the Fairness Foundation for helping put this event together. The session's going to be available online for you to watch and share, and we really look forward to seeing you at the next one in the series as well. It's going to take place on the 28th of November, and we're going to be revisiting the influential and award-winning Spirit Level with its authors Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson. We've just put some details in the chat so you can sign up now. But with that, we'll see you then, and thank you again, and goodbye.